Imagine, if you will, a radical newspaper run according to democratic, egalitarian principles. It's owned by the journalists, editors, and typesetters who produce it, and they decide collectively how it's going to cover the news. All the staff are paid the same wage, so there's no pay gap between fat cat bosses and underpaid grunts, let alone any interns slaving away for nothing. And advertisers have no influence over the content or editorial stance, since there is no advertising at all. In these days of multimedia empires owned by right-wing tycoons, this sounds like a delusional fantasy. Even if such a thing existed, you might think, it would be torn to shreds by the mainstream press within a few days, or some government would find an excuse to close it down. And yet, such a paper did once exist. You'll need a strong stomach to hear the story of the French paper Libération. What happened to it is a tragic cautionary tale for anyone interested in alternatives to the mainstream media and in genuine press freedom. The impulse for the paper came from the wave of social protest in France at the end of the 1960s, the upsurge of 68 producing strikes, student movements, and a widespread rejection of the established order. In the early 1970s, a number of journalists and intellectuals started thinking about setting up a newspaper as a counter to the capitalist press, which had played such a large role in supporting the government of the day and pushing for a return to business as usual. Any movement for radical change would have to have its own press, which would, of course, have to be run differently from the capitalist press. In 1973, a group that included the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre set up a new paper. They called it Libération, partly as a homage to the newspaper of the French Resistance, published from 1941 to 1964. But the name also signaled what the paper's ultimate goal was: liberation of everyone from the shackles of exploitation. The first issue, which appeared in February 1973, was only 4 pages long, a modest broadsheet, but as its manifesto-like editorial statement put it, "Our poverty is the measure of our independence." The paper had 3 founding principles: a single equal salary for all employees, full ownership by the people who work there, and no advertising, because according to its manifesto, advertisers control and censor the press. The paper wore its political commitments on its sleeve, not surprising given that many of its staff were also left-wing political activists, several of them Maoists. There were a lot of internal battles in its early years, including a major contretemps in 1974, when most of its original team resigned, and Sartre handed over as editorial director to Serge July, who would run the paper for the next 30 years. But the real turning point came in 1981, a year after Sartre's death, when a series of changes began to take place that totally altered the essence of the paper, a process described in painful detail by French journalist Pierre Rambert in a 2005 book. The first thing to change was the ownership structure. The paper's management wanted to increase circulation to 50,000, and to do that, claimed it needed more investment, so capital had to be brought in from outside, diluting the share owned by the paper's staff. There were protests at the paper, and in February 1981, the entire staff was made redundant, and then those willing to work under the new rules were rehired. Over the next decade and a half, ownership of 80% of the paper shifted from the hands of the staff to outsiders. Stage 2 in Libération's transformation came a year later, in 1982, when its pages were finally open to advertising. Serge July claimed that it was not Libération that was normalizing by having adverts, but advertising itself by appearing in Libération. The man who in 1973 had said, "There won't be adverts in Libération as long as I'm alive," less than a decade later was saying the paper was incomplete without it, since the paper had to reflect the new cultural values of the time. Once the commercial door had been unlatched, it wasn't long before it swung wide open. Within a few months, the paper was doing commercial tie-ins with the Spielberg movie E.T. These changes were unsurprisingly accompanied by alterations to the paper's editorial stance. On the international front, its previous rejection of Cold War polarities was dropped, contributors such as André Glucksmann applauding the US's deployment of Pershing missiles in Western Europe against what they called the totalitarian threat of communism. And the paper obligingly kept stum over Washington's crimes in Central America, a real change from the attitudes of its founders who, like Sartre, would have kept up a constant critique of imperial abuses in the developing world. Domestically, the paper went from a staunch radicalism to embracing the centre-left Parti Socialiste, energetically supporting the presidency of François Mitterrand. To some extent, Libération simply reflected the shifting ideological winds of the time, as parts of the French left abandoned their old commitments to Mao's Little Red Book and took up with neoliberal economics. The paper's economics section was symptomatic. Political scientist Pierre Rosanvallon wrote a string of pieces helpfully instructing readers in the new doctrines. One piece from 1982 was titled "Learning Austerity." Another, the same year, suggested rethinking the goals of social security, while a third asked professorially, "Have you read Hayek?" As Pierre Rambert points out in his history of the paper, Libération was also affected by the changing media ecology of the time, as TV started to become the dominant way people received information. Like plenty of other outlets, Libération allowed its choice of front-page news to be shaped by the previous evening's TV bulletins, a stance that left it playing catch-up with someone else's agenda rather than making its own. But the story of Libération is also, in a sense, the collective portrait of a whole generation of French progressives, mirroring their journey from 70s radicalism to bourgeoisification in the 80s and 90s, part of a process of normalization, or in third-way jargon, modernization, of the French left. Libération's journalists were originally drawn from the ranks of activists and intellectuals, but over time they were recruited more and more from elite French universities like Sciences Po, or from other establishment media outlets. The paper's management sold this as a healthy professionalization, but it was also another kind of normalization. Libération correspondingly moved from the left margin of French political life to a more prominent position at its center, becoming the organ of a modernizing, market-friendly, vaguely social democratic politics. The normalization process accelerated in the 1990s as Clinton and Blair picked up the baton from Thatcher and Reagan, and capitalism triumphantly described itself as the only game in town. Libération's stance was by now firmly Atlanticist, admiring the American capitalist model and seeing the US as playing an indispensable role in sustaining the globalized world order from which everyone surely benefited, didn't they? By the end of the 20th century, the paper was fervently supporting humanitarian warfare in Kosovo, and in 2003 it backed the invasion of Iraq, even though most of the French population was against. Again, changes in the political orientation of the paper echoed changes in its ownership structure. In the year 2000, a British investment fund bought a 20% stake in the paper, and 5 years later, multimillionaire Edouard de Rothschild bought a 2/5 stake. Both transactions were celebrated by the paper's managing editor as consolidating its independence, though Rothschild himself was more dubious. He told one interviewer that he thought it was a little bit utopian to want to separate the editorial side from the shareholders. Well, quite. Libération began its life aiming to give the people a voice. What has it become? What role does it now play in French political and cultural life? And whose voice is it? Pierre Rambert nicely captured the present-day spirit of the paper when he described its combination of political conformism, economic orthodoxy, and cultural eccentricity. In cultural terms, Libération benefits from its leftist origins and association with the counterculture of the 60s and 70s. It's way more rock and roll than the fusty papers for grown-ups like Le Monde or Le Figaro. And since the 90s, it has been much more keen to surf the wave of new technologies. It was the first French paper to have a website, for example. In other words, it is unmistakably the paper of a social group the French call bobos, bourgeois bohemians. By 2013, its idea of cultural revolution was no longer what Mao would have had in mind, but referred instead to what property developers and culturepreneurs had done to the urban fabric of Marseille. Libération's whiff of the counterculture is totally separated, of course, from any radical political commitments. Over time, the paper has essentially become an appendage of the centre-left Parti Socialiste, loyally backing whatever candidate the party puts up for election, though its triumphant front page when François Hollande won the presidency in 2012 was amusingly underwhelming. Perhaps because their président is such a limp croissant, the paper has been especially keen to attack any opponents on the left, with a running campaign to discredit far-left parties and candidates such as Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It's had something of a foreign policy confusion of late, publishing a front page in August 2013 decrying Assad's impunity for his crimes one day, only to publish one 3 days later wondering what the point of a war in Syria would be. It's been obligingly supportive of Hollande's intervention in Africa, though. In January 2013, it pondered the reasons for war in Mali, and in December it hailed him as a gendarme in Africa. The paper's embrace of economic orthodoxy has been as firm as its political conformism. When Sarkozy and Merkel sought to impose on Europe an eye-watering fiscal austerity pact, the paper's editorial thought the agreement contained some good news. And when Italy brought in former Goldman Sachs banker Mario Monti to run a technocratic austerity government in 2011, it praised this widely loathed lizard as highly popular, someone who could re-establish Italy's credibility by carrying out far-reaching reforms. There's a contradiction at work, though. The more Libération has moved to occupy the centre ground, the more readers it has lost. Its print circulation seems to have peaked around 2001 at around 175,000 copies. Since then, it's declined steadily, slipping to the 100,000 mark in 2013, a 40% drop in a little over a decade. It claims many more online readers, of course, though how such figures are arrived at is always a mystery. The paper's response to falling print sales has been to chase more advertising and commercial tie-ins, including desperate sales ploys such as the one offering readers a bottle of wine and local gourmet products chosen by the paper's editors and packaged in a Libé box. Editorially, the paper has become increasingly incoherent. Its pages are a jumble of boxes and snippets where news is almost indistinguishable from advertising, a seamless culture of consumption in which its readers are rarely challenged. By April 2012, the paper's staff had had enough and wrote an impressive letter of protest. Their list of grievances is worth quoting since it's a mini-media critique in its own right. Attention-grabbing front pages that distort the paper's principles. Pseudo-news based on interviews rather than reportage and research. An editorial partisanship that subordinates the paper to the Parti Socialiste. Sidelining of entire sections of the paper such as social issues, the environment, immigration. Hiring policy based increasingly on precarious freelance workers. Organizational and editorial confusion due to clear disagreements among the management. And dubious advertising campaigns launched without consulting the staff. Sadly, the staff's protest went largely unheard and the paper has continued very much along the same lines. In February this year, there was another outburst of protest from the staff against the investors' plans to cut staff and reorient the paper away from its print operations and towards more reliably profitable multimedia business. This time, the fallout spilled onto the front page. "We are a newspaper," said the headline, "not a restaurant, a social network, a cultural space, a TV platform, a bar, a startup incubator." For the moment, this is true, but the logic of the paper's development since the 80s suggests it won't be for very long. The paper's current chief, Laurent Geoffrin, who had previously been both its editor and managing director, once boasted about having helped turn a political group into a normal business. In a sense, this is the mundane truth of Libération's story, an ordinary tale of street-fighting youth sliding into conformist, materialistic middle age, which would be depressing enough. But there's something especially soul-destroying about Libération's transformation over the years. After hollowing out its original principles and purposes, as Rambert puts it, it became a newspaper without a project, without ideas, without a spine. The whole process is summed up, in fact, in the paper's name. The very word liberation should surely still have some radical emancipatory charge, but in this case it's no longer clear what it signifies. Liberation of who? From what? Most of the time, the paper is known simply as Libé, a casual shortening that conveniently lops off the rest of what could otherwise be a dangerous word. These days, it may be the newspaper with the most meaningless name. And yet, the example it set when it started is still there. Its founding principles waiting for us to pick them up again, and this time be true to them.